You are listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio. To follow is the lecture entitled Examining the Gospel of Mark. Enjoy and have a glorious day.
The Gospel of Mark was the first Gospel that was written, at least as far as the Gospels we have today. It was used as a primary source by the authors of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and was possibly even used as a source by the author of John's Gospel as well. In light of these facts, it seems that the Gospel of Mark is a major foundation of the biblical Christian portrait of the historical Jesus. It becomes an important question, therefore, in light of this, how much of the Gospel of Mark is accurate history? Have you ever wondered where the stories came from? Whether or not the stories are historical or just fiction? Or if we can even know this in the first place? Well, the more I've studied this issue, I've become more and more convinced that at least the majority of the stories in Mark's Gospel are historical and are not fictional. In this documentary, I will be offering a case for how we know this. My case can be outlined as follows. First, we will examine evidence that Mark's Gospel is primarily based on the eyewitness testimony of a disciple of Jesus named Peter. If this is true, then the majority of the Gospel of Mark would be an eyewitness account. Second, we will substantiate that Peter's testimony was not dishonest, and that Peter truly believed he witnessed what he claimed to. And third, we will examine the evidence that Peter did not hallucinate his eyewitness experiences. If all three of these premises are true, we then have no choice but to consider Mark's Gospel as a historically accurate account of the events concerning the life of Jesus, insofar as it records what Peter, the reliable disciple of Jesus, claimed to witness. What really matters, though, is how much evidence there is that these premises are actually true. And that's what we're going to be discussing for the rest of this documentary. The evidence. It would be somewhat difficult to know where an author of a particular writing received his information about the content of his work before knowing who the author of that writing was. So before we attempt to establish that Peter's testimony forms the backbone of Mark's Gospel, I find it necessary to know who the author of Mark's Gospel was. Most critics today will tell you that we don't know who wrote any of the Gospels, including Mark's Gospel. However, many scholars combat this position. Many scholars argue that there is strong evidence to suggest that the traditional author of Mark's Gospel was the author. Before we discuss this evidence, I'd like to make a point about internal anonymity. Mark's Gospel is internally anonymous, meaning that it doesn't tell us who its author was. Many critics conclude from this fact that we don't know who wrote the Gospel of Mark. This is, however, a naive conclusion. Many works of antiquity that form the basis of a significant amount of historical knowledge about the Roman and Hellenistic worlds are internally anonymous, just like Mark's Gospel. Examples include the biographies of Plutarch and the Annals of Rome by Tacitus. Despite the fact that these ancient writings are internally anonymous, we do know who wrote them, based on evidence from other writings, written somewhat shortly afterwards. So the real question here is, what external evidence is there that tells us who the author of Mark's Gospel was? The evidence is considerably early, and as we will argue, is quite reliable as well. An account of who Mark's Gospel was written by is found in the writings of the early 2nd century bishop of Hierapolis. His name, Papias. The late 2nd century author Irenaeus noted that Papias was a man of ancient times and a companion of Polycarp. Papias' writings, the 5-volume work known as Interpretations of the Oracles of the Lord, have been lost to us over time, yet Eusebius and many other early Christian authors preserved some parts of it. For the next few moments, we'll be discussing 2 quotations Eusebius makes of Papias' writings. The first quotation contains an explanation Papias provides concerning where he himself received the information for his writings, which I think is necessary to discuss because if we didn't know where Papias received his information, it would be hard to tell if he was reliable or not. The other quotation Eusebius makes of Papias that will be is an account of the authorship and background of the Gospel of Mark. We are first going to discuss the quotation concerning Papias' sources for his information, and then we'll discuss the more interesting and relevant quotation to our discussion, which is the one concerning the Gospel of Mark. So, in the third book of his church history, this is what Eusebius quotes from Papias concerning where he, Papias, received his information for his historical writing. Quote, "I will not hesitate to add also for you to my interpretations what I had learned with discretion from the presbyters and have carefully memorized, which gives certainty to its truth. For I was not satisfied, as many are, with those who have a lot to say, but rather with those who teach what is true, nor with those who relate strange teachings, but rather with those who relate the teachings which were given by the Lord to the faith and came down from the truth itself. And if any associate of the presbyters came to me, I would inquire for the sayings of the presbyters, what Andrew said, or what Peter said, or what Philip, or what Thomas, or James, or what John, or Matthew, or any of the other Lord's disciples, and for the things which other of the Lord's disciples, and for the things which Aristion and the presbyter John, the disciples of the Lord, say." Unquote. So, as is evident from this quotation, Papias informs us that he received his information from the associates of those who he calls presbyters, and the presbyters were essentially authoritative Christian leaders in the first century who, as Papias informs us, had directly learned from and heard the apostles, who were primary disciples of Jesus. Now that we have a grasp of where Papias received his information, we will now turn to what Papias, as quoted by Eusebius, has to say on the Gospel of Mark. Quote, "The presbyter had said this: Mark, who became the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately that which he remembered. What he wrote down in the deeds of Christ, however, was not in exact order, for he had not heard or accompanied the Lord. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessities of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a regular narrative of the Lord's sayings. Thus, Mark made no mistake in writing some things as he remembered them, for he was especially careful about one thing, which was not to leave out anything he had heard, and not to put anything false into the statements." Unquote. So there it is, a very early piece of evidence telling us who wrote the Gospel of Mark. The majority of scholars and critics over the past few centuries have done entire injustice to this evidence, and even in some cases completely ignored it. The objections to Papias' reliability on Mark's Gospel are few, and as we will now see, they do not justify the position that Papias was mistaken about the authorship of Mark's Gospel. The first objection, which is made by more unsophisticated critics, is that Papias' account is hearsay, and thus should not be trusted. While Papias' account is hearsay, this fact is rather irrelevant. Papias is only removed by about 3 stages of transmission over a course of about 50 years, and it's not as if we don't know where he received his information. So in order to refute Papias' account as evidence of who wrote the Gospel of Mark, one must provide a hypothesis as to how Papias' source for his information was actually mistaken. This leads us to the second objection against Papias' reliability on Mark's Gospel. This objection essentially says that Mark's Gospel was not originally ascribed to Mark, but rather was ascribed to him at a later date by precedents to Papias, who wished to boost the credibility of the Gospel itself by claiming Mark wrote it. This, however, is an untenable explanation that has serious difficulties. The strongest difficulty for this objection is why Mark's name would be chosen as the author of an unascribed gospel, if anyone could be chosen as the author. If an early Christian sought to give credibility to a gospel, they wouldn't claim it was written by an obscure non-eyewitness. if you could choose anyone to be the supposed author of a gospel that you wish to make credible, why not choose an eyewitness as the author, such as Peter, or some other eyewitness? The fact that it was Mark who was said to be the author of Mark's Gospel ends up proving that Papias' tradition is very honest and thus reliable. And this leads us to the third and last objection against Papias' reliability that we will be considering in this documentary. This objection tries to dismantle the refutation just provided to the second objection by attempting to explain the rise of the Markan tradition of authorship from a slightly different angle. It says that even though Mark was not an eyewitness, it is still conceivable that he would be falsely chosen as the author of a gospel that he didn't actually write, since Mark was connected to Peter, who was an eyewitness. However, this objection suffers from the same problem that the second objection does, since if the Gospel of Mark was not originally ascribed to anyone, how come the inventors of the Markan tradition of authorship didn't choose Peter himself as the author of the Gospel instead of complicating things and choosing Mark? Again, it makes no sense that they didn't choose an eyewitness as the author, unless, of course, we admit that the Markan tradition of authorship is, in fact, reliable and trustworthy. So like the first two objections to Papias' reliability, the third objection fails as well. So in light of the fact that there is no good objection to the reliability of Papias on the Gospel of Mark, as far as I'm aware, we are thus permitted to accept that we have reliable information concerning who the author of Mark's Gospel was. But we are not just given information about the author, we are also given information, reliable information that is, concerning the primary source of the Gospel of Mark itself, which as Papias affirmed was the preaching of Peter. So what does that tell us about the truth of the premise stated earlier in this documentary that Mark's Gospel is primarily based on the testimony of Peter? It tells us that there is good historical evidence of this. Before we move on to discuss the second premise of my case, I would like to note some internal evidence, not just the external evidence that we've discussed thus far, that supports the proposition that Peter's testimony generally forms the backbone of the account in Mark's Gospel. Here's just a few clues within the Gospel itself that suggest this. First off, the first disciple of Jesus mentioned in Mark's Gospel is, you guessed it, Peter. He is mentioned in almost every chapter and is the most mentioned disciple of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. Secondly, out of all four Gospels, Peter is referred to the most frequently in Mark's Gospel. This comparison takes into account that Mark's Gospel is the shortest of all four Gospels and also even disregards the fact that the other Gospels depend in some instances on the Gospel of Mark for their references to Peter. Thirdly, the vast majority of the narrative in Mark's Gospel takes place in which Peter would be an eyewitness of what is happening. It is therefore very conceivable that the Gospel of Mark is, in a general sense, Peter's perspective of the events surrounding the historical Jesus. Fourthly, there are a number of times in which Peter is singled out and emphasized in the narrative of Mark's Gospel over the other Gospels. One such example of many is when the disciples James, John, and Peter are found sleeping in Gethsemane by Jesus. Jesus could have chastised any three of them, but Mark records that he particularly spoke to Peter, not James or John. What makes this particularly fascinating is that the parallel account in Luke has Jesus addressing all three of the disciples, not particularly Peter. And in Matthew, while Jesus poses the question to Peter, he asks the question in a way that addresses all three disciples. And so this example of many demonstrates to us that the Gospel of Mark places a certain emphasis on the Apostle Peter. There are many more interesting facts I can mention, but I think we've seen quite clearly that Mark's Gospel contains a number of clues that suggest it was based on the testimony and preaching of Peter, as Papias affirmed. So in sum, we have seen thus far that there is good evidence to suggest that the Gospel of Mark was written by an individual named Mark, who was a companion of Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, and that Mark used Peter's eyewitness testimony as a primary source for his account of the historical Jesus. Since we now know that Mark's Gospel primarily consists of stories about Jesus that were told by a disciple of his named Peter, who claimed to witness them firsthand, we must now determine how reliable the testimony of Peter is. But how do we determine such a thing? Well, let's look at our options. 1. Peter's eyewitness testimony could have been the result of dishonesty. 2. It could have been the result of hallucinatory experience. 3. It could have been the result of actual eyewitness experiences. Without these three options, it is not conceivable how Peter could have claimed to be an eyewitness. So which option is the correct one? Was Peter a liar? Was he deluded? Or was he truly an eyewitness? I think the only plausible option is that Peter was truly an eyewitness of the events surrounding the historical Jesus, and that it is inconceivable that he either lied about his testimony or was deluded into believing his testimony due to hallucinations. One thing we can know for sure is that Peter sincerely believed he had witnessed the things he claimed to about Jesus, and thus could not have been lying about them. Here's 3 reasons. Number 1. It is hardly conceivable that Peter would propagate a culturally blasphemous, socially disgusting, and flat-out unpopular set of ideas about Jesus if he did not actually believe those claims were true, and if he wasn't actually motivated by his belief that they were true to spread them to the whole world. In the Roman Empire, especially Judea at the time of the 1st century, social rejection and even governmental persecution were the wages of proclaiming openly that Jesus or any man was the Messiah, that he was king over the whole world, that Caesar wasn't, that Israel would be judged by God for their sins, and so on. It is totally inconceivable that Peter would promote such beliefs that called for persecution had he not believed them to be true. The second reason for how we know that Peter most likely sincerely believed he had witnessed the things he claimed to about Jesus is the fact that the story in Mark's Gospel is far too embarrassing to have been made up, or to have been the result of dishonesty and conspiracy. Let me explain. If Peter's eyewitness proclamations were simply stories that he made up, and were complete lies, then do you think Peter would make himself look like a weak, completely inconsistent individual? He probably wouldn't do that. But we find that there exist in Mark's story many occasions where Peter is portrayed as an unfaithful, unreliable, and unstable individual. One of many examples is in Mark 14, where after Peter promises he wouldn't lose faith in Christ, he openly denies him numerous times before the next day. And as I said, there are numerous examples where Peter is portrayed as an unfaithful, unreliable, and unstable individual in Mark's Gospel. The point here is that these examples show that Peter was not concerned with portraying himself as a believable witness, and so this adds strength to the fact that he was simply proclaiming what he believed to be true about Jesus. The third reason that we will be discussing for why Peter sincerely believed he had witnessed the things he claimed to about Jesus is that we have direct and early evidence that Peter was, as a matter of fact, persecuted and executed for his proclamations about Christ. A bishop in Rome and a contemporary with Peter the Apostle by the name of Clement writes in his first epistle to Corinth, quote, "Let us take the noble examples of our own generation. Through jealousy and envy, the greatest and most just pillars of the church were persecuted and came even unto death. Peter, through unjust envy, endured not 1 or 2, but many labors, and at last, having delivered his testimony, departed unto the place of glory due to him." Unquote. It has been said, and proved to be correct, that no one would willingly die for a claim which he or she does not believe is true. Since Peter submitted himself to persecution and even death for his testimony, which was his proclamations about Jesus, we may conclude from this fact that Peter believed what he preached. He believed his testimony was true. And so I conclude, in light of what we have discussed thus far, that we are more than justified in considering it a fact that Peter was not dishonest about his eyewitness proclamations concerning the historical Jesus. We have seen thus far that the majority of Mark's Gospel consists of stories told by Peter, a disciple of Jesus. We have also noted that Peter claimed to be an eyewitness of these and that he most likely believed them to be historically true. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are historically true. There is also one more possibility we must examine, which is the possibility that Peter hallucinated these stories and thus became convinced of them. On the surface, this might sound like a good hypothesis, but upon closer investigation, it fails miserably. Let us firstly note that hallucinations in which explicit stories are contained within occur subject to only one person's mind. For example, multiple people cannot hallucinate a transfiguration of their prophetic leader in the exact same place at the exact same time. At least, the odds of that happening look something like this. That's actually kind of interesting though, isn't it? Because in most of the stories of Mark's Gospel, wherein Peter is said to be a witness of the events, other disciples, members of the 12 apostles, such as John, are also said to be witnesses of the events as well. Does that therefore mean that there were multiple purported eyewitnesses of the stories preached by Peter that were recorded by Mark? That is, in fact, very likely. Many sources beyond Mark's Gospel attest to the existence of the apostolic community and consider Peter as the most popular member of that community. So is it at all likely then that Peter would be allowed by other apostles and disciples to say that they alongside himself witnessed events which in fact they would Peter be allowed by John, for example, to say that he and John both witnessed the transfiguration if in fact John didn't witness the transfiguration? The answer, of course, to both of those questions is no. Peter would only be allowed to say that other disciples witnessed the stories he told if in fact they actually claimed to witness them. So that should be enough to tell us that the stories in Mark's Gospel which Peter apparently claimed to witness and claimed other disciples witnessed were in fact stories told by multiple eyewitnesses of Jesus and his ministry that were part of the apostolic community. And thus, in light of this fact, hallucination cannot explain the proclamations of Peter on which the Gospel of Mark is generally based. We've seen that Mark's Gospel was written by an associate of Peter the disciple of Jesus, who used Peter's eyewitness testimony as the primary source of the Gospel he wrote. We've also seen that Peter's testimony was not dishonest, nor was it the product of psychological deception. And this means we must conclude that Peter believed his testimony because he truly witnessed its content in reality. He saw Jesus do certain things. He heard Jesus say certain things. And his eyewitness testimony, his reliable eyewitness testimony, is the backbone, the primary source of the Gospel of Mark. Perhaps Mark's Gospel isn't as unreliable as skeptics often make it out to be. After all, it contains the testimony of a reliable disciple of Jesus.
Thank you for listening on Second Chance Ministry.